因縁の鎖を断ち切りたくば今は戦え。
敵はただ一つ、次元食い。
間違いなく次元最強の戦士だ。
どうか勝利を。
Okay. Did you understand that? I didn't. As a kid growing up with the Super Nintendo, I didn't realize how many games I was playing were actually Japanese games translated in English. It was before the internet, so I had no way of knowing that extra information. Like that Final Fantasy 2 and 3 were actually 4 and 6, missing out on the real 2, 3 and 5. Or that Secret of Mana had a sequel, the awesome Seiken Densetsu 3, who, until recently, was only available in English through emulation with fan-made translations. As you can probably tell, English is not my first language. I'm French-Canadian. In my province, Quebec, the majority of people speak French, yet the games I was playing were all in English. Still, my young gamer self was fascinated by video games, role-playing games in particular, which had a lot of text that I would not understand. So, armed with a French-English dictionary, I slowly learned English one translated word at a time. My first RPG was Dragon Warrior on the NES, which had almost no icons, and the very first room of the game asked you to go down some stairs to move on, to which you had to stand over the stair tile, open a menu and select stairs, which is really not easy to do when you don't know any of those words. Suffice to say that I was stuck in that first room for a very long time. So I was slowly learning English through my passion for video games, not really noticing weird English translation from Japanese, as it didn't even occur to me that those games were not made in English in the first place. Until the day my brother convinced me to combine our Christmas wishlist to ask our parents to buy a Super Nintendo bundle. If you were to buy a second controller with the console, you would get The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. But not any Link to the Past, a special French-Canadian version. It was the first time I was playing a game that I was actually understanding everything. Before that, I would look for keywords in the main quest to look it up to understand where to go next. In that game, I could actually talk to NPCs, who would only small talk, get a feel of the mood and the vibe of the game. I could finally immerse myself in the game's universe, understand the story, experience a game the way it was meant to be experienced. It was an isolated incident though, and I had to wait years to experience it again. Donkey Kong Country 2. It was the first time I saw a language option. Within the same cartridge, I could switch from English to French. It's probably something that made its way earlier in Europe since there's more language diversity. But in North America, only 4.74% of the population speaks French. More than half of them in my province. To give you an idea, there are more people speaking French in Italy than in Canada. You heard me right. Not France, Italy. Because there were different physical copies in Europe and North America, it was often the case that a French version existed but wasn't included in the North American version. Until in 1997, the Quebec law forced video games to include the French translation of games if it existed. So North Americans, if you ever wonder why NA video games often only had English and French as options, not Spanish or any other languages, that's why. But today, physical copies are not as common as they used to, and buying a game digitally is becoming the norm. Meaning those translations can reach anybody in the world, no matter where. But is it worth it to translate your game? I mean, if the gamers like video games, they can just learn English like me and play the game in English. No. As a kid, I had to learn English to play video games. It's not true anymore. As more games are translated, more people are used to play video games in their language, and will look for games in their language. It's an echo chamber. On the internet, you speak in English to other people around the world, making you think that everybody speaks English, but you just don't talk to those who don't. 17% of the world population speaks English in some way, with only 5% of the world being native speakers. But what about gamers? Surely, I'm not the only one who learned English driven by video game interest. Looking at some Steam statistics, it appears to be the case, as 34% of Steam users use English as their main language, which is the majority, but is still less than Chinese and Russian combined. Okay, but is it worth the effort? Some localization can be hard. Chinese and Russian have a different alphabet, you would need a new font, and some languages like Arabic are read from right to left, which complicates the process even further. I get you, if you're a small indie dev, you might not have the resources to do so. But what about this? If you take all the languages in the top 10 that use the same alphabet than English, they amount to 19% of the Steam users. Combined with English, you are now reaching more than half of the Steam users. It's hard enough to make a video game and then convince people it's worth their money, so it's better to increase your pool of possible players by broadening the language options. Also, to my fellow Québécois, there's a 7.5 tax credits from the provincial government for games including a French translation. The Canadian Media Fund also funds games that are both in English and French. Localization can also go beyond translation. A game can be altered for cultural reasons. Some games remove religious references, tone down gore or nudity, or remove a certain symbol for the German audience. It can also be an accessibility change, like having AZERTY keyboard support, or a whole perspective change, as first-person games are not as popular in Eastern countries. Or even a whole game like Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which was made specifically to introduce the Western audience to RPGs, who were not that popular at the time. It's a simplified version of the standard JRPGs of the time, with a killer soundtrack. I'm a video game programmer, not a translator, but I'm trying to broaden my skills. I'm learning pixel art, I'm learning game design, I'm even trying a bit of narrative design. I made a small game earlier this year called Fast, who is a narrative platformer with a good amount of dialogue, perfect for trying out translation. Another thing that would be perfect is if you would subscribe to my channel. I do devlogs about my personal projects, which are small pixel art games. So to dip my toe into localization, I took on the project of translating my game Fast from English to French and adding a language option. It was harder than I expected. There's definitely a reason why there are professional video game translators out there. Sometimes it's hard to understand the context of the text, even if I'm the one who wrote the English version. I didn't realize how many play of words I did in English that would not work in French. English expressions that are not a thing in French. Also, I'm French Canadian. We have our own expressions, our own slang, and obviously the goal was to have the game be playable by any French speakers. So it was a challenge to translate it in an international French, using words that I don't really use myself, especially when it came to slang and swearing. I also had issues with the text length, as French words are generally longer than English, or something that is said in 3 words in English can sometimes be said in 7 in French. So I had to make a couple of UIs larger and some font sizes smaller. Since I don't have input remapping in my game, I also added AZERTY keyboard support as another form of localization, since most French speakers use AZERTY keyboards. This project gave me a newfound respect for video game translators, and gave me experience with the process. Not just translation, but adding that translation into the game with all it implies. I feel localization is a must for any commercial games nowadays. You can have an audience from all around the world. It would be a shame to miss out on those potential players. I'm Rocky Mullet. If you want to try my narrative platformer Fast, or any other games of mine, the link is in the description.